I've always been a big fan of the fact that speedrunning is, for the most part, a cooperative effort. It feels primarily like a group of players fighting the game rather than each other. At the end of the day though, it is still a competition, and competitive players need to keep an eye out for ways to get an edge on their fellow runners. One of the optimizations I've always found particularly fascinating is the use of language in a speedrun. To be clear, I'm not talking about revisions or updates that are made when a game gets released in a new region. That typically results in a whole new leaderboard. What I'm referring to is the simple choice of language from a list of options in the same game, which could be significantly harder to find if players from all around the world weren't all focusing on the same goal. In some cases, time saved from a language is as simple as Kingdom Hearts' Final Mix. There are several sections of this game where text advances one character at a time, and the player can progress to the next dialogue once all the text is loaded in. Japanese words in text are typically much shorter compared to English. The dialogue boxes simply complete faster in Japanese, and this saves about 46 seconds across the entire PC run, according to runners of the game that are much smarter than me. This does present a few issues for runners that aren't practiced in reading Japanese though. Running the game in such a vastly different language can be intimidating. Without being able to read the items you're equipping, you can lose confidence that you've executed menus correctly, or may miss other visual cues. Additionally, if you recognize that you've made a mistake, it'll take significantly longer to correct, if you even can.
Huh? Was he meant to unequip something? I don't have time to think about it.
With a game as optimized as this, a world record wouldn't be possible without using the Japanese text. It can be a bit easier though when the optimal language more closely resembles your native language, such as when English speedrunners change to Final Fantasy VIII's optimal language, French. Since French uses a lot of very similar characters to English, it can be a bit easier to make the switch, but in other ways, things get a bit more complicated. In Final Fantasy VIII, specifically its original PC release, it was discovered in 2015 that French is the fastest language by a margin of about 6 minutes. In part, this is due to text mostly being shorter than English, but the big time save actually comes from the animations of the text boxes. The animation itself is unintentionally faster for most European languages, and they open and close about 40% faster than intended, which is massive over the course of the 7.5 hour run. This has a really interesting side effect found in a manipulation that I talked about in a previous video. I'll link the full video in the description, but basically the last boss of Final Fantasy VIII randomly selects your party. Speedrunners manipulate this RNG to get a more desirable party by setting up a timing for the final text box. This is where the party selection locks in right as the player confirms they want to fight the boss. However, the language of the game has an actual impact on this manipulation. The confirm option becomes available once all the text is loaded in, with different translations having different lengths of text in this text box, and the animation being faster in some languages. Timing setups in one language won't necessarily work for another, which, yes, I have learned the hard way. French is only an advantage in the PC version, however, due to the nature of region and language differences at the time of Final Fantasy VIII's original PlayStation 1 release. It's time to get a bit boring and talk about PAL and NTSC. For those unfamiliar, different regions had different formats to adhere to TV and power supply standards at the time. PAL, mostly found in Europe, Oceania, and some parts of Asia, runs at 50 Hz. NTSC regions such as North America, Canada, and Japan run at 60 Hz. This typically makes NTSC a more favorable platform for speedrunners, as without developers making adjustments to counteract the differences, PAL games run at 5/6 the speed of their NTSC counterparts. This is the case for Final Fantasy VIII, so PlayStation players really only run NTSC formats. PAL games can be quicker, take Crash Bandicoot 2 for example, But either way, for games from this time period, we'll typically see a single format dominate the leaderboards. Occasionally though, we see instances where both PAL and NTSC are represented fairly evenly on the leaderboards. This is the case for Crash Team Racing. Naughty Dog are praised highly for a lot of aspects of development in their early games that are very creative ways to work around hardware limitations. One thing they did really well is match game speeds and performance between PAL and NTSC versions. Despite PAL typically running at 5/6 the speed, Crash Team Racing only runs at 5/6 the frame rate, 25 frames per second on PAL compared to 30 frames per second on NTSC. This is unlike Mario Kart 64, for example, that effectively runs in slow motion on PAL, making it unviable for full game RTA runs, and better for time trials. The two ports of Crash Team Racing are both perfectly viable for RTA runs at a high level, and you can see that by the representation of formats on the leaderboard. Of the 372 runs done in the any% no major glitches leaderboard at the time of making this video, 262 are done on NTSC and 103 are done on PAL. If you narrow that down further to the top 50 runs on the leaderboard, 18 of them are done on PAL and 32 are done on NTSC. This isn't a spread of formats you'd find if both weren't viable, but these versions aren't exactly one-to-one. The in-game physics is tied directly to the frame rate. The main result of this is that on PAL, your jump height is slightly lower than it is on NTSC. For a game with crazy shortcuts and speed tech, this seems like it would be detrimental, but fortunately it's not all that bad. The only jump that becomes remarkably harder on PAL is this boomerang jump on Polar Pass, skipping this massive U-turn. This is an incredibly optimized jump, however, and even some top 10 runs opt for an easier version that gains speed from a boost pad further down the straight. For the most part, some jumps and shortcuts may be harder, but they're still fine. The other major piece of tech that's affected on PAL is froggying. By holding one drift button and rapidly tapping the other, your kart will repeatedly hop with significantly less traction on landing. This is good for maintaining speed previously built, especially in off-road sections. The problem on PAL is that this rhythm can get sort of stuck, which results in that speed being lost, and the player will need to go back to drifting to try and build that speed again. To clarify, these are not balance updates or intentional version differences, they're just byproducts of matching the performance as best as possible across all regions. PAL is, though, technically optimal for two reasons. One of these reasons is the reserve system. By doing drift boosts as this bar fills up, the player builds speed in reserves, which is exactly as it sounds, backup speed that's maintained when the player is not drifting. Not only does PAL allow the player to have more reserves, but they act differently, and when paired with other speed tech, actually become way faster than NTSC. This is cemented further by looking at the time trial leaderboards. They're absolutely dominated at the top level by PAL consoles. And here's where language more directly comes back into play. PAL Crash Team Racing has access to the best language of any speedrun game I've ever seen. When prompted for a language at the start of the game, the player is presented with these options. The best one to choose is pressing triangle to cancel out of the menu, which continues on to the main menu, but doesn't select a language at all. This removes all text and all voice dialogue from the game. This includes skipping the mask dialogue after each race, allowing the player to act sooner after a race is completed. They no longer need to wait for the "Congratulations, you win a trophy" dialogue, which saves about 2 seconds per track starting from Glacier Park. This has some other fun side effects, such as the masks appearing and saying nothing, and the bosses' heads being rearranged. And it's hard to notice, but their dialogues do as well. One of the swaps is Komodo Joe's opening dialogue being replaced with N-Oxide's dialogue at the end of the game. This means that when you reach Komodo Joe, the game kind of freaks out because it's trying to load the ending, but the ending hasn't happened yet, so the game decides to just skip it entirely. This saves about 30 seconds. Not selecting a language saves almost 50 seconds, and in a game like this, that's a sizable advantage. So there's inherent time save from not selecting a language. The game runs well on PAL and is technically optimal. So why are the top 3 runs done on NTSC? Especially the world record holder. Hypnoshark is from a PAL region. Well, I kinda lied. For most players, the slightly lower jumps are fine, but they do end up being detrimental at the top level for RTA runs. Full game RTA runs demand consistency. PAL is really only stronger with the help of a lot of optimizations, tight timing for shortcuts, and remarkably precise driving. Time trial players can implement these things that RTA runners simply can't. Sure, it sucks to lose a run on lap 3 to a frame perfect trick, but the run's only 1 to 2 minutes long. Time trial players get more attempts at their runs each play session. Banking on frame perfect tricks and turns with mere pixels of leniency on every track in a 50-minute long run is just going to result in 0 finished runs ever. NTSC can also do this pause and unpause on the mask dialogue to achieve nearly the same effect as the mask dialogue skipping on its own with a language glitch. It's got a tight timing window. I think I've heard players say it's frame perfect, but I might be misremembering. Regardless, even I've gotten a few of these just by mashing. Full game runs simply require a different skill set than time trials, and it's one that at the absolute top level, NTSC is just more compatible with. Now, some of you watching with quick maths may have noticed that the tally I put up earlier didn't actually add up to 372 runs. So, where are the rest of them? Japan is an NTSC region, so why does almost nobody play the Japanese version? In terms of gameplay and performance, it's 1-to-1 with NTSC-U. There are some different character portraits, a combo counter, and some other small quirks. However, the big time difference also happens to be in boss dialogues, except it's a loss. Every single boss dialogue, with the ironic exception of Komodo Joe's intro, is slower by several seconds. The most notable examples are Ripperoos' intro being 6 seconds long in the US version, and 19 seconds long in the Japanese version. And the Pinstripe post-race dialogue that goes into Oxide's intro is 25 seconds long in the US version, and 1 minute and 2 seconds long in Japanese. This is detrimental at the top level. You would not even come close to a world record if you were playing on the Japanese version. But if you're just playing the game to learn and have fun, this is perfectly fine. What I love most about Crash Team Racing as a speedrun is that if you still have a console and a copy of the game, you have everything you need to start running. Like any other hobby though, people become more comfortable making a financial investment in better equipment once they find themselves engaging enough to warrant it. But starting out, there's really no pressure at all to get specific consoles or discs or jump through literally any hoops to get what you need to have a kit that you can get into the top 50 with. So there we have it. 3 games, each with varying impacts and benefits of the languages that speedrunners choose to play in. Maybe at some point I'll actually look at examples of games that got rebalanced versions with patches, buffs, and added content and so on, but we'll see. Thank you all so much for watching. I took a short break over the holidays and hosted a speedrun event called Cyrothon, where I had 48 straight hours of excellent speedrunning to raise money for a good cause. It was an excellent time over on Twitch. And thank you as well to our Patreon supporters. They had some behind the scenes on this stuff, and they get to vote on a monthly speedrun challenge, which coming up in a few days is going to be Spyro 1 on the PlayStation. So if you also want some good behind the scenes stuff, voting on those monthly challenges and access to the Discord and everything, Patreon's a very cheap and very generous way of supporting the channel. However, if you don't want to, that's perfectly fine as well. Your best way to support this channel for free is just send the video to a friend that you think will enjoy it. Thank you all again, and see you next time.